I have kept this record because I believed someone should. Not for publication, not for the newspapers that printed their tidy explanations in the autumn of 1892, but because 5 children vanished from the woodland outside Ballymoor. A 6th nearly followed them, and the men sent to find the cause left that forest in the dark hours before dawn, having seen things no official document has ever described accurately. I was one of those men. I'm the last of them still living. Something lived in that forest. It had lived there far longer than the village itself. And in the autumn of 1892, it began calling the children closer. My name is Edmund Farrell. In 1892, I was 31 years old, employed as a forestry surveyor by a firm based in Galway that contracted boundary work across Connaught. I measured disputed timberlands. I marked estate boundaries, recorded the growth condition of managed woodlands, and occasionally assisted county officials when their clerks lacked the practical knowledge to navigate rough terrain. It was honest and solitary work, and I was well suited to both qualities. In September of that year, I received a letter from Magistrate Gerald Heron of Ballymoor in Western County Galway, requesting my assistance with what he described as a search and survey operation within a section of disputed forest land connected to several recent child disappearances. The fee offered was modest but fair. The letter mentioned the work would take no longer than 2 weeks. I arrived in Ballymoor on the 17th of September by cart from the nearest post road, travelling west from Galway through a landscape of grey stone walls, bog cotton, and low hills where the cloud never fully lifted, even at midday. The village was small, perhaps 40 households clustered along a single road above a river valley. The church and the magistrate's office faced each other across a modest square. Beyond the village, the land fell away into the valley and rose again to a long ridge covered in oak woodland that stretched further than I could trace with the eye. That woodland was the reason I'd been hired. Magistrate Heron met me that first afternoon and explained the situation directly. Over the preceding 6 weeks, 5 children from the village had gone missing. Their ages ranged from 7 to 12 years. Each disappearance had occurred near the boundary of the oak forest to the west, in the valley below. In each case, the child had been seen by a family member approaching or walking near the tree line, and in each case they had not returned. The most recent incident had occurred 9 days before my arrival. A girl of 9 named Bridget Sweeney had walked toward the forest in full afternoon daylight within sight of her older brother, who had been working a nearby field. By the time he crossed the field boundary, she had entered the tree line and was gone. He found her the following morning standing at the edge of the stream that ran along the forest boundary, barefoot and silent, unable to explain where she had been or why she had gone. She was the one who had nearly been lost entirely. The 5 before her had not returned. Our patrol consisted of 4 men. Constable Patrick Kearney was a broad and methodical officer in his late 40s from a town 20 miles east, experienced in rural investigations and with the particular habit of writing down whatever was said in a meeting before he responded to it. Thomas O'Rourke was a gamekeeper from a nearby estate, lean and weathered, 10 years younger than Kearney, with the quiet economy of movement that comes from years of watching things from a distance. He had worked that landscape for over a decade and knew the woodland paths as well as anyone outside the village itself. The 4th member was a young farmhand from the village named Cormac Lyons, 19 years old, retained as our guide. Cormac was the only one of us who had grown up in Ballymoor and the only one who had lived his entire life within sight of the forest. And at the preparatory meeting that evening, Heron spread the ordnance map on his desk and asked Cormac to mark the relevant areas. Cormac pointed clearly to the outer sections, the eastern boundary paths, the ridge trails. Then he stopped. Kearney asked whether there was additional ground further and worth examining. Cormac said there was a stream roughly half a mile into the forest, running north to south, that marked the boundary of what the village called the Inner Wood. He said the patrol could work the outer sections without difficulty. What lay beyond the stream was a different matter. No one from the village had crossed it in his lifetime. Not for timber, not for hunting, not for any practical reason. He said his grandmother had told him the deep oaks had been old when the first stones of the church were laid, and that the people who had been in this place before the parish had known to leave that section of the forest alone. Kearney wrote something in his notebook and said we would make our own assessment when we reached the area. I recorded nothing about that exchange. Every woodland district in Ireland had some version of that kind of cautionary tradition, built from generations of children being warned away from dangerous ground and eventually constructing an entire oral history around the warning. I had surveyed enough of them to stop being curious about it. I did not yet understand that the difference between a superstition and a warning is usually discovered only after you have ignored it. We established camp on the morning of the 18th of September, then moving our kit and supplies along the valley track to a clearing about a quarter-mile from the forest's eastern boundary. The clearing had been used by charcoal burners some years previously. The ground was level, a fire ring had been dug and stone-lined at some earlier time, and a low frame of posts and cross-beams remained standing well enough that we fixed a canvas over it to protect the gear from rain. The weather in those first days was typical for late September in that part of Galway. Cool mornings with low cloud burning off by mid-morning, occasional sharp showers in the afternoon, and clear cold evenings with a hard chill before full dark. The valley smelled of wet soil and leaf decay, the honest smell of autumn woodland, and in those first days there was nothing about the environment that felt unusual. No, we followed a clear daily routine. Rise before 7, morning patrols through the outer woodland paths, midday mapping of trails and boundaries, evening return to camp for record-keeping. Kearney and I took the outer path each morning while O'Rourke and Cormac worked the inner paths of the outer woodland section. We met at midday at a waypoint near an old field boundary, exchanged notes, ate a simple meal, and reversed our routes for the afternoon circuit. Back at camp before 5 or half past, where I would transfer measurements into the survey log while Kearney wrote his patrol report, and O'Rourke tended the fire and evening meal. The outer sections appeared ordinary. Dense oak canopy, moss-covered stones, narrow livestock paths winding between the trees. We found evidence of old rabbit snaring and a collapsed shelter that might have been a seasonal shepherd's hut from some decades past, and the remains of a small campfire near the northern path that was at least 3 weeks old. Nothing suggested a person currently living in the woodland, yet the deeper sections produced a quality I found difficult to name precisely. Not a sound or a sight, but a quality of stillness. The outer woodland had the usual background texture of birds working the canopy, leaves moving with the light wind, the distant rhythm of the stream. But when I looked inward toward the heavier oaks beyond the first 100 yards, that texture changed. It went flat and closed, the way a room feels when the door has just been shut behind someone. I noted it in my journal as atmospheric variation, likely caused by the depth of canopy reducing wind penetration. I described it in practical terms because practical terms were the tools available to me at the time. But I noticed it every day after that, and it never felt less deliberate. O'Rourke mentioned it on the third evening without my having said anything first. He was sitting by the fire cleaning his boots when he said, almost without looking up, that cattle on the estate where he worked would go right to the edge of this kind of forest and simply stop. Not because they smelled a predator. He had seen cattle ignore wolf sign in the hills without hesitation. This was different. They stopped as though they had reached a boundary that was clear to them and opaque to everyone else. Kearney said that without a specific threat to identify, animal behavior was not relevant to the investigation. O'Rourke said nothing further, but he caught my eye across the fire, and there was something in his expression I understood without either of us speaking. The recognition that what we were noticing was not imagined, even if we had no adequate vocabulary for it. The first object appeared on the afternoon of the third day. We had taken the interior path, curving south and then west toward the deeper woodland, heading to examine the stream bank conditions Kearney wanted to document. The path was narrow and well-worn, old enough that it had sunk slightly below the level of the surrounding ground, the kind of hollow track that suggests centuries of use. I was walking approximately 20 feet ahead of the others when I stopped. In the center of the path, resting upright against a small root, was a carved wooden figure roughly 4 inches in length, shaped like a small person, so crudely made from a single piece of pale wood, with 2 notched arms and a head marked by a simple incised line. The kind of figure a child carves with a small knife during a slow afternoon. The base sat clean and level on the root. No debris had blown against it. No mud had splashed its surface. It had been placed there recently, within the past several hours, positioned with deliberate care in the center of the path, where it would be impossible to miss. Kearney arrived behind me and noted it in his book. He said it might have been dropped by one of the missing children. I said the word dropped did not seem right given the way it was positioned. He said he took my point and wrote that down as well. We found the second object 12 yards further along the path, a length of red ribbon, perhaps 8 inches long, and tied in a simple knot around a twig that had been pressed into the soft earth at the path's edge. Tied deliberately, not snagged on passing vegetation. 20 yards beyond that, a copper coin sitting flat on a stone that jutted from the bank, cleaned of mud, placed in the stone's natural depression as though set there to be found. O'Rourke counted the spacing between the 3 items and said the distances were near identical. Nobody spoke for a while after that. That evening I sat for a long time with my notes, thinking about the spacing. 12 paces, 20 paces. The consistency implied measurement. Not the rough approximation of a person moving casually through the forest, but the deliberate interval of someone who had thought carefully about where each item should go. And I wrote, objects placed along interior path in deliberate sequence. Spacing uniform, positioning suggests intention, purpose unknown. Then I closed the log and sat listening to the forest in the dark, which had fallen completely by then and which was utterly without sound. On the 4th day we found the footprints. The ground along the stream bank was soft, a mixture of dark silt and decomposed leaf material that held impressions well. Kearney had wanted to examine this area because 2 of the 5 missing children had last been seen near this section of the forest edge, and he believed there might be tracks missed in the initial search conducted by the village men in the days immediately following the disappearances. We found tracks within 10 minutes of reaching the bank, small bare footprints in the silt, belonging to a child of perhaps 8 or 9 years, each impression clear and well-defined, the trail beginning approximately 40 feet east of the stream and proceeding westward along the bank. We followed carefully, walking to the side to preserve it, Kearney sketching each footfall in his notebook with measurements. The trail reached a clearing roughly 30 feet across, where a ring of very old oaks grew, their roots lifting from the soil in great arching ridges that formed a natural enclosure. The moss within was thick and undisturbed, a deep emerald layer built up over years or decades. The footprints crossed the clearing to its approximate center and stopped. No continuation in any direction. No disturbance in the moss to suggest the child had turned, fallen, knelt, or been dragged. The final footprint was simply the last, and as though the next step had been taken somewhere the ground had not recorded. Kearney examined the surrounding moss on his hands and knees for nearly 20 minutes. He checked along both sides of the clearing in case the trail had shifted to harder ground. O'Rourke worked the outer perimeter of the oak ring. Nothing. I stood in that clearing and felt the slow settling of a weight, the way you feel when a calculation you have been trusting is shown to be wrong, and everything built on it must now be reconsidered. Children did not simply stop walking in a closed clearing and leave no further trace. I was a man trained to read landscape, to interpret soil and vegetation and the material record of things that had moved across the earth. I had spent 10 years doing this work, and the record here said that a child had walked to the center of a clearing and ceased to exist within it. I wrote that the trail terminated at a point of uncertain cause, and that further investigation was required. That night, I heard the first sound from the forest. I was awake past midnight. The fire burned down to a low red glow. Kearney and O'Rourke asleep in the tent. The sound came from the tree line to the west, in the direction of the deeper forest. It was laughter, or the echo of laughter, the particular acoustic quality of high voices heard through trees and distance. Children's voices, soft and intermittent, rising and falling with no discernible pattern, never approaching, never fully fading. I sat up and listened for several minutes, then woke Kearney. And he listened for 2 minutes in silence and said it could be sound carrying from the village, that voices traveled strangely through valleys at night. I knew the village was over a mile northeast of our position on the far side of a ridge. The physics did not support what he was suggesting. But I said nothing further. Cormac was awake outside. I could see his shape had shifted. In the morning he looked as though he had not slept at all. When I asked whether he had heard it, he said he had heard it before. As a child, living in the village, when the wind was right. He said his mother had always told him and his brothers not to answer it. I asked him what he thought it was. He picked up his kit and said it was time to start the morning circuit. I let the subject rest, but I did not forget what he had said, and I did not forget the tone in which he had said it. There was no fear in his voice. It was worse than fear. It was the flat, particular calm of someone who has known a danger all their life and has simply learned to accommodate it. The lanterns were moved on the 6th night. We had returned late after an extended afternoon circuit, following a section of disturbed undergrowth O'Rourke had wanted to trace to its origin. The light had been failing by the time we reached camp. Both lanterns had been burning when we left that afternoon. Kearney had lit them before we departed because the heavy cloud cover had made the mid-afternoon dim. They were not beside the tent when we returned. I found them on a fallen log at the clearing's edge, approximately 15 feet from where they had stood. Both placed side by side, my handles turned in the same direction, wicks trimmed and cold, not blown out by wind, deliberately extinguished and deliberately positioned. No footprints in the soft earth around the log, no impression in the moss nearby. Nothing disturbed within the camp itself, no supplies moved, no ties loosened on the canvas. Kearney walked the perimeter of the clearing twice with his lantern and said he could find no trace of entry. O'Rourke stood quietly for a moment and then said that whatever had moved the lanterns had known we were away and had been waiting for exactly that. Not to take anything. Not to destroy anything, to demonstrate that it could. We slept in shifts from that night onward. 2 men awake, 2 resting, rotating every 3 hours. The forest had stopped being simply a search area. It had begun interacting with us. And on the 7th morning, the line of objects appeared. It stretched from the camp's western edge all the way to the path leading toward the inner wood, a distance of perhaps 80 yards. Objects placed at measured intervals, in a straight line pointing directly toward the stream and the deeper forest beyond. A bone button from a child's coat, a twist of blue wool yarn knotted once, a small flat stone marked with a scratched line on its surface, a copper pin of the kind used to fasten a shawl, a fragment of white cloth matching the described clothing of a boy named Sean Connolly, aged 10, who had vanished 7 weeks before our arrival. And at the end of the line, positioned where the forest path began to curve toward the stream, a small wooden whistle, unbroken, clean, placed on its side on a flat root with its opening pointed toward the deeper trees. O'Rourke looked at the line from one end to the other for a long time without speaking. Then he said, quietly, that this was not a trail left by a person moving through the forest. This was an arrangement, placed by someone who had come out from the trees during the night, worked methodically along a measured line, and returned before dawn. Kearney said it was possible the objects had been carried out by the missing children themselves, who might be surviving somewhere within the woodland. O'Rourke asked him to explain the spacing. Kearney had no answer for that. I crouched beside the whistle for a long time without touching it. The wood was smooth and slightly worn from handling. It had been a child's instrument, played often, and it had been placed here with the same deliberate care as everything else, the same measured intention, the same quality of communication I had begun to recognize across all of these discoveries. Because that was what it was. Communication. Objects placed where we could not miss them, patterns we could not rationally dismiss. Whatever lived in that forest was speaking to us in the only language it had apparently decided we might understand. We documented each item and left them in place. The following morning they were gone and a new line had appeared, beginning 5 yards further toward the stream than the first had ended. We were being drawn forward, step by measured step. On the 8th evening we found the girl. We had been on a late patrol pushing our circuit further than usual along the southern path. We were still attempting to trace the origin of the disturbed undergrowth from earlier in the week. The light was low and bronze through the oaks, the sun nearly gone behind the ridge, and we were moving at a good pace to make camp before full dark. Cormac stopped first. He was ahead of me on the narrow path, and he stopped so suddenly I nearly walked into him. He made no sound. He simply held up one hand, palm facing backward, and became completely still. She was standing at the stream's edge. A girl of perhaps 9 years in a dark dress muddied at the hem and a grey wool shawl, barefoot despite the cold. She was facing the opposite bank toward the deeper woodland, her head slightly tilted as though listening to something across the water. Entirely calm. Not the calmness of a child recovering from a fright, but the calmness of someone engaged in quiet attention, like a person standing at a window watching weather. Kearney identified her within a few minutes from the descriptions in his files. Her name was Mare Cornelie, 9 years old, missing 4 days. Her face was clean, no scratches, no signs of exposure beyond the muddied hem and the cold that had reddened her arms below the shawl. Kearney spoke to her gently. She turned toward us without alarm, as though she had known we were there all along. He asked where she had been. She said she didn't know. He asked how she had come to be at the stream. She was quiet for a moment, then she pointed across the water toward the inner wood and said that they had told her to come back, that it was time. He asked her who they were. She looked at the far bank and said nothing further, and we wrapped her in O'Rourke's coat and walked her back along the valley track to the village, just over an hour. Her father came out of the house before we reached his gate. Having seen the lanterns on the track, and the reunion was the silent, fierce kind that belongs to people who have not permitted themselves to believe the worst, but have been very close to it. I stood at a distance and felt the particular discomfort of knowing what the father did not. His daughter had returned from somewhere she could not name, had been sent back on a timetable that was not her own, and had no memory of the days between. Walking back to camp in the dark, I thought about what she had said. They told her to come back, that it was time, not that she had escaped or wandered out of the trees by chance. She had been sent back. The distinction seemed, and in the cold dark of that valley road, to be the most significant thing we had yet learned. Whatever was in the forest had returned one child deliberately. The others it had kept. The question that occupied me was the logic of it. What determined who returned and who did not? I had no answer that night. I'm not certain I have one still. The circling began around the 10th night. I became aware of it gradually, the way you become aware of a sound that has been present for some time before your attention fixes on it. A branch displaced in the outer darkness to the north, followed 10 minutes later by a similar sound to the west, then south, not the discontinuous and unpredictable quality of random forest sounds. These were measured, the intervals too consistent for accident. She tracing a slow orbit around the clearing over the course of approximately 40 minutes before going silent. I marked directions and timings in my notebook. When I plotted the sequence across 3 consecutive nights, the pattern was clear. Something moving at a deliberate walking pace, pausing occasionally, then continuing. Not running, not fleeing, not charging, circling methodically, as though mapping the boundaries of our occupation the way I myself would map a disputed parcel of land. Getting measurements, O'Rourke said when I showed him. Getting a picture of what had come in. He had seen deer do something similar around new structures in their territory. I said I did not think this was deer. He said he knew that. The sightings had begun a day or two before the circling became unmistakable. During an evening patrol near dusk, Cormac had stopped without warning and pointed without speaking. I followed his line of sight to a clearing perhaps 50 yards ahead, where the trees thinned briefly before thickening again. A figure stood at the far edge of the clearing. It was small, the size and shape of a child of perhaps 8 or 10 years, standing upright between two oak trunks with its hands at its sides. At that distance and in the fading afternoon light, it appeared entirely human. But the quality of its stillness was wrong. Children, in my experience, do not stand still in that particular way, the whole body fixed without the subtle, unconscious shifts of natural human posture. It stood the way a held breath feels, compressed, deliberate, entirely controlled. I called out to it. My voice carried clearly across the clearing. The figure turned its head in response, in a slow, deliberate rotation I could see even at 50 yards. Then it stepped behind the nearer oak trunk and was gone. We crossed the clearing to the trees where it had stood. No footprints in the leaf mold beneath the oaks. No impression in the soft, mossy ground cover. No broken twigs, no disturbed branches. Nothing. As though the figure had stood on the air above the ground rather than on the ground itself. Kearney spent 10 minutes searching the surrounding area and then stood quietly before writing in his notebook. I looked over his shoulder at what he had put. Figure observed, child-sized, rapid withdrawal. No physical trace. No explanation available at this time. I had never seen Kearney write no explanation available before. He was a man who preferred to leave lines blank rather than admit insufficiency. Seeing it written in his neat and careful hand was, in its understated way, one of the more unsettling things I had yet encountered on that patrol. The voices in those middle nights were different from what we had heard in the first week. Those earlier sounds had been faint and far, carrying qualities that might have had a mundane explanation if you wanted one badly enough. What we began hearing from the 10th night onward was closer and more distinct, and carried a quality I find even now extremely difficult to describe accurately. It sounded like children, the pitch and rhythm of young voices, the particular cadences of children at play or at conversation, the rise and fall of speech that has not yet settled into adult patterns. But the words were not words, or if they were words, they were not in any language I recognized. Not Irish, not English, not any variant of either that my ear could resolve into meaning. The sound came from within the tree line, close, perhaps 30 or 40 yards from the camp edge, and it continued at intervals for an hour or more before ceasing. The effect on the group was severe. Kearney sat through it the first night with his notebook open and nothing written, which I had never seen before. O'Rourke moved to the edge of the firelight and stood there for long periods with the concentrated attention he normally reserved for tracking. Cormac wrapped himself in his blanket with his back to the fire and said nothing at all. What the sound felt like was an imitation. The surface qualities of children's voices reproduced with great technical accuracy, but without the interior quality that gives human speech its life. And like a musical instrument tuned precisely to the correct pitch but played without expression, technically correct and experientially hollow. Whatever was producing those sounds had learned the form of what it was mimicking without having access to its substance. That hollowness was the thing that stayed with me longest. On the 11th morning, I sat with the survey log and patrol records and laid out everything we had documented in sequence. The carved figures and objects leading toward the inner wood. The children's belongings arranged in measured lines. The footprints that ended without explanation. The lanterns moved during our absence. The returning girl who said she had been told it was time. The figures at the tree line. The circling at night, the voices, that I'd trained myself over 10 years to read landscapes through their accumulated evidence, to build a picture from physical traces the way a document is assembled from individual records. I was not a man who leaned toward dramatic interpretation. I preferred to let the evidence arrive at its own conclusions. What the evidence was saying was this: there was an intelligence in the inner woodland. Not human in form, not in any way I understood that word, but an intelligence nonetheless. Something that observed, assessed, and responded. Something that understood human behavior well enough to exploit it systematically, placing objects where curious people would find them, timing its activities to our schedule, calibrating its approaches to produce maximum effect without triggering immediate flight. And it had been doing this with the children for some time before we arrived. The carved figures, the found objects, the voices at the edge of hearing. These were not new behaviors hastily applied to a new audience. They were established behaviors, refined over time, calibrated to the particular openness of a child's attention. We had become the second audience, and the same methodology had been turned toward us, not to lure us the same way it had lured the children, I believed, but to understand us, to take our measure, to determine what we were and what we would do. That was the realization that finally overturned my original framework for the investigation. Something in that forest had been calling the children, not hunting them, not chasing them, not taking them by force, calling them, and building an enticement that was patient and elaborate and perfectly calibrated to the natural curiosity of a child, drawing them one by one across the stream and into the inner wood over the course of weeks. And when we arrived and disrupted the pattern, it had turned its attention to us with the same methodical patience it had devoted to them. I wrote in the log, "The disappearances are not the result of a human criminal. They are the result of deliberate enticement by a non-human intelligence of unknown character operating from within the inner woodland. The investigation should be concluded and the area abandoned. Recommend immediate report to Magistrate Heron." I showed it to Kearney. He read it twice. He sat quietly for a long time. Then he said he could not report that to the magistrate. And he said what I had written was the kind of statement that ends careers and invites ridicule. He said he needed something more concrete before he could carry that conclusion to any official record. I told him the 13th night might give him something more concrete. It did. We had agreed, all four of us, that we would not sleep on the 13th night. Kearney had suggested it with the policeman's logic that if the patterns we had documented were real, sustained observation through a full night might provide the specific evidence his report required. We banked the fire to a steady burn, positioned ourselves around the clearing with clear lines of sight into the surrounding trees. O'Rourke took the northern edge, facing the inner woodland. Kearney took the southern. Cormac and I sat at the fire. The first 2 hours of the night were quiet in the pressured, flat way the forest had been producing for several nights now, the silence that feels less like absence of sound and more like deliberate suppression of it. Near midnight, the voices began. They were closer than they had ever been before. Not at the tree line, but within it, close enough that the individual voice-like qualities were more distinct than they had previously been. The rises and falls, the pauses, the overlapping of multiple sources giving the impression of conversation or of play. For several minutes they seemed to come from a consistent direction, slightly north of west, in the area where the path curved toward the stream. Then they spread. The sound divided and moved, resolving into multiple separate sources that distributed themselves around the clearing's perimeter over the course of perhaps 15 minutes. First north, then west, then south, then a fourth source appearing to the east between the camp and the valley track behind us. O'Rourke was the first to see them. He made no sound. He simply held up his hand flat, palm downward, the signal we had agreed on for visual contact, and I followed his line of sight. They were standing in the trees to the north. 3 of them, perhaps 4. I could not achieve a precise count, because they occupied the visual space between the oak trunks in a way that made their edges uncertain, partly occluded by branches, partly by the limits of the fire's light. They were small, the size and form of children, standing motionless in the darkness between the trees in a loose grouping, each one still in that same wrong way I had been observing at greater distance for the past several days. The total and inhuman stillness of things that are choosing not to move rather than resting in movement. Additional shapes to the west and to the south. Kearney had risen to his feet at the southern edge of the clearing and was looking outward into the trees. I could see from his posture that he was seeing what O'Rourke and I were seeing. The slight forward lean, the arrested quality of movement that belongs to someone whose preparation has not covered what they are currently facing. We had been surrounded quietly over the course of an hour, while we watched from the inside. And I looked at the figures in the northern trees and tried to impose the framework of human understanding on what I was seeing. Children sheltering in the forest, watching our fire from curiosity. Local young people conducting some late-night roaming of the kind that young people sometimes did. Any explanation that kept the situation within the territory of the comprehensible. Then one of them stepped forward. It moved out of the tree cover into the outer edge of the fire's light, perhaps 20 yards from where I sat. What I saw in those few seconds has been with me for over 30 years, and I have spent much of that time finding the precise words for it. Not to make it dramatic, not to make it frightening, simply to record it accurately. And because accuracy is the discipline I was trained in and have tried to apply to these events throughout. It had the form of a child. The size was right. The general proportions were right. The way it stood on 2 legs and held its arms was recognizably human in structure. But every individual element of its movement was wrong in the specific way that a very precise copy of a thing is wrong. Correct in every measurable dimension and incorrect in every experienced one. It walked with the deliberateness no child walks with, each foot placed with considered intention, the shifting of weight managed rather than natural. Its head was inclined slightly forward in a way that suggested absorption, the focused attention of someone studying an unknown specimen. It was studying us. I believe now, as I have believed for 30 years, and that this was its purpose in coming forward. Not to threaten, not to take. To look at us from a shorter distance than it had previously allowed itself, to complete some assessment it had been conducting over the preceding 2 weeks from a range that no longer satisfied it. O'Rourke raised the lantern. The figure stopped. The light reached it, but seemed to find it somehow resistant to full resolution, not darkness, not absence, but a quality in how it occupied the light that prevented the clear picture I had expected. I saw enough. I saw what I have described. And then it tilted its head, that same slow and calibrated motion I had seen at the tree line days before, and it stepped backward into the darkness between the trees. Behind it, and to the west and to the south, the other shapes began to shift. Not fleeing, not rushing, nor withdrawing with the same deliberate patience they had arrived with, in their own time and on their own terms. Within minutes, the tree line was empty. The voices were gone. The forest was silent in the flat, pressured way it had been silent on the very first day, before we had understood what that silence meant. None of us spoke for a long time. It was Kearney who finally said something. Very quietly, and with a steadiness that I believed cost him considerably. He said that he thought we should pack our gear and be off this ground before first light. No one disagreed. We worked through the remaining hours of the night in near silence. We struck the tent, packed the supply frame, loaded everything onto the handcart, and walked it out along the valley track by lantern light. From the forest to our left for the full mile until the ground rose and the trees fell behind us, and the village lights appeared ahead on the ridge. I looked back once. The tree line was a dark mass against a sky beginning to show the first gray of early morning behind the ridge. Nothing moved along it. Nothing was visible in the space beneath the oaks, but I had been in that forest long enough to know that the absence of visible things was not the same as the absence of presence. We reached Heron's house before 6 in the morning, and Kearney knocked until Heron answered the door in his nightshirt with a lamp in his hand. Kearney gave his report standing in the front hall while Heron listened with the expression of a man hearing something he had prepared himself not to hear. Kearney was direct and specific and described only what could be materially documented: the objects, the tracks, the lanterns, the returning girl, the figures at the tree line and at the fire. He did not use the language I had used in my log. He did not suggest the nature of the intelligence he had observed. He stated the facts in sequence and concluded by saying that in his professional judgment, the woodland was not safe terrain for a patrol of 4 men, and that the investigation should be suspended pending a larger and better equipped response. Heron asked whether the 5 missing children could be recovered. Kearney said he did not know what was in the deeper forest and did not believe his patrol was in a position to find out. The investigation was formally suspended that morning. So the official report Heron filed with the county offices attributed the disappearances to dangerous terrain in an unmapped section of the western woodland, noting that several of the missing children might have become lost in areas beyond practical rescue reach. It recommended the woodland be declared hazardous and a permanent warning notice posted at the valley track. No further search was organized. No additional patrol was sent. The families of the 5 missing children received official correspondence expressing regret and explaining that the investigation had reached the limits of what practical search methods could accomplish in difficult mountain terrain. I returned to Galway and completed my contract notes with no reference to the specific nature of what we had observed. My survey log from the Ballymuir contract was filed as a standard boundary survey, with a notation that the interior sections of the woodland were inaccessible due to terrain conditions. I have the original in my possession still. The formal language tells almost nothing of what was actually documented there. O'Rourke returned to his estate work in the north of the valley. I received a brief letter from him the following spring. It said only that the paths leading to the inner wood had grown over by late October, that the villagers had extended the boundary they refused to cross, and that the objects along the forest path had not reappeared once the patrol had left. He wrote that he believed the arrangement of objects had been meant specifically for us, that once we were gone, the need for them had ended. I've thought about that letter often, about what it implies about the purpose of those objects. Whether they were genuinely an enticement, the same kind of calling that had been used on the children but modified for adult psychology. Or whether they were something else, an attempt to communicate something we were never equipped to understand. I do not know. I have never known. Kearney retired from the constabulary some years after Ballymoor. I saw him once, perhaps 10 years later, at a county function in Galway, and we spoke about other things and did not mention the forest at all. There was a quality to the way we spoke around it that I recognized as the particular avoidance of 2 people who share a complete understanding of something, and have both decided, separately and for the same reasons, that the understanding serves no purpose spoken aloud. Cormac Lyons I never saw again after that morning in Heron's front hall. I have hoped, in the intermittent way one hopes for people one barely knew, that he found some accommodation with it. He had lived his entire life within sight of that forest, had grown up hearing those sounds from the village on nights when the wind was right, and had spent 13 days in closer proximity to whatever caused them than any living person from Ballymuir had likely done in generations. That is a weight I would not want to carry alone, and I hope he did not have to. The 5 children were never found. I need to state that plainly because the official record allows it to remain abstract. Lost children in dangerous terrain took a bureaucratic conclusion that carries the shape of tragedy without its weight. 5 children from a small village in Western Ireland entered a forest and did not return, and the investigation supposed to determine what happened to them was abandoned after 13 days because the 4 men conducting it encountered something they could not explain, could not control, and could not safely approach further. That is the truth the official record contains in a form it cannot directly say. What I believe, stated as belief rather than documented fact, is that those children were not victims of random misfortune. They were called there by something that had existed in those ancient oaks far longer than the village, far longer than the parish, possibly far longer than any human presence in that valley. Something that had a consistent and purposeful relationship with the boundary of its territory and with the human world that existed at that boundary. Something that understood children in a specific and particular way, understood their curiosity and their willingness to follow a sound or a light or a voice into unfamiliar ground, and used that understanding with patience and intelligence to draw them across the stream and into the inner wood one by one over the course of weeks. Whether it kept them or took them into a place not accessible from our side of whatever boundary that stream represents, I do not know. I have spent 30 years not knowing and have accepted that I will not know before I die. What I do know is what I observed on those 13 days. The forest was not empty and had never been empty. The figures we saw on that last night came to look at us with deliberate intention at a distance of their own choosing, at a time of their own selection, and withdrew when they had finished looking. They left us alone. I have turned that fact over many times in the years since, trying to understand whether it was mercy or indifference or simply the conclusion of an assessment that found us not worth further investment. Whether the same intelligence that had been calling children across that stream had looked at 4 adult men with their lanterns and their notebooks and their careful, limited documentation of things they could not comprehend, and decided we were not what it was looking for. Children come to a call differently than adults do. They believe in what they hear before they question it, and they approach the unknown with an openness that experience eventually closes. I had lost that openness so long before those 13 days that I could not even fully remember having had it. The forest knew the difference. It had always known the difference. The fairy woods outside Ballymuir are still there. The parish records indicate the area was declared unfit for agricultural use in 1895 and has not been subject to any subsequent development or forestry contract. The stream still runs along the boundary of the inner wood, I imagine, as it has run for centuries before any of us were born. The great oaks still stand as they stood before the first stones of the church were laid, and something still lives in there, in whatever relationship it has always maintained with the edge of the human world. I record this not as a warning, because warnings of this kind arrive too late for the people they are meant to reach and too quietly for the people who make decisions to take seriously. I record it as a correction. The children did not wander. The forest was not empty. And whatever called them there in 1892, in the patient and ancient dark beneath those oaks, had been doing so for longer than any of us had the framework to comprehend. I've never forgotten the arrangement of objects along that path, the care of the spacing, the deliberateness of the placement, the fact that each item belonged to a child who was gone. I've never forgotten the way the figure stood at the edge of our firelight and looked at us, and I have never forgotten the quality of the silence that followed when they withdrew. It was not the silence of something that had left, and it was the silence of something that had simply stopped allowing itself to be heard.